pay attention to the Muslim activist in the front row praying. His name is Musab. He just helped block this entire highway for public prayer with dozens of protesters. Then he suddenly stands up, panicking as an emergency vehicle remains trapped.
My name is Musab. I'm 28 years old, and on June 11th, 2019, I participated in what I thought was righteous activism. What happened next changed everything I believed about serving God. I thought I was defending my faith. Instead, my faith was about to be completely transformed. The seeds of that day were planted months earlier when our community felt under attack. Every news cycle seemed to bring another story about Muslims being discriminated against, our mosques vandalized, our children bullied at school. I watched my younger sister come home in tears after classmates called her a terrorist for wearing her hijab. The anger burned inside me like a fire I couldn't extinguish. That's when the organizer appeared at our mosque. He was a charismatic man in his 40s with a thick beard and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through you. He spoke with the kind of passion that made you want to follow him anywhere. During Friday prayers, he would stand up after the imam finished and deliver these powerful speeches about standing up for our faith, about not being silent in the face of oppression. Brothers and sisters, he would say, his voice echoing through the prayer hall, when they attack our faith, when they try to make us invisible, what do we do? Do we hide? Do we apologize for who we are? The congregation would murmur their agreement, and I felt that familiar fire burning in my chest. No, he would continue, we make ourselves seen. We show them that we are not afraid to practice our faith anywhere, anytime. The idea for the highway protest came during one of our planning meetings in the mosque's basement. About 30 of us had been gathering regularly to discuss ways to make our voices heard. The organizer spread out a map of the city on the folding table between us, his finger tracing the major highways that cut through the metropolitan area. Imagine this, he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. A rush hour on a Wednesday afternoon, thousands of commuters forced to witness our devotion to Allah, no hiding in our mosques, no praying in private corners. Right there, in the middle of their daily lives, they see us bow before our Creator. The room fell silent. Even I felt a chill run down my spine. Blocking a highway wasn't just a protest, it was a complete disruption of people's lives. But the organizer continued before anyone could voice their concerns. Think about it, he said, leaning forward with intensity. For 5 minutes, maybe 10, the entire city stops. They can't ignore us. They can't pretend we don't exist. They have to witness our faith in its purest form. I raised my hand tentatively. But what about emergency vehicles? What if someone needs to get to the hospital? The organizer's expression hardened for just a moment before softening into a patient smile. Brother Musab, he said, sometimes sacrifice is required for the greater good. We're fighting for the soul of our community. A few minutes of inconvenience is nothing compared to decades of oppression. The way he said it made me feel foolish for asking. Around the table, other men nodded in agreement. The enthusiastic supporter, a young man about my age with eager eyes, spoke up. The Prophet himself faced opposition when he prayed publicly. This is our test of faith. Over the following weeks, we planned every detail. Secret group chats coordinated timing and locations. We scouted the highway intersection during different times of day, noting traffic patterns and police patrol schedules. Each participant was assigned a specific vehicle and position. Prayer mats were distributed, along with detailed instructions on how to exit vehicles simultaneously and arrange ourselves for maximum visual impact. I threw myself into the planning with complete dedication. This felt like the most important thing I had ever done for my faith. When the skeptical friend, an older man who had been coming to our meetings, expressed concerns about the legality and safety of our plan, I dismissed his worries as weakness. "You're thinking like someone who's been beaten down by the society," I told him after one meeting. "We can't let fear control us anymore." But deep down, something nagged at me. The night before the protest, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my bedroom. My prayer rug was spread on the floor beside my bed, and I found myself looking at it in the darkness, wondering if what we were planning was truly what Allah wanted from us. The morning of June 11th arrived grey and humid. We gathered before dawn in the parking lot of a closed shopping center about 5 miles from our target intersection. The atmosphere was electric with nervous energy. Men checked their phones constantly, reviewing the timing one final time. Some performed ablution using water bottles they had brought, preparing for the prayer that would shut down one of the city's busiest highways. The organizer moved between the groups, offering final encouragement and reminders about positioning. "Remember," he said when he reached me, placing his hand on my shoulder, "today we make history. Today we show them that our faith cannot be hidden or silenced." I nodded, but my mouth felt dry. As we loaded into our designated vehicles, I caught sight of the skeptical friend standing apart from the group. He had decided to participate despite his reservations, but his face was pale with worry. The drive to the highway felt surreal. Normal morning traffic surrounded us, commuters sipping coffee and listening to radio shows, completely unaware that their Wednesday afternoon would be unlike any other. I followed the van in front of me, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When we reached the target intersection at exactly 2:30 p.m., everything happened with military precision. Vehicles pulled over simultaneously across all 4 lanes. Doors opened. Men emerged carrying prayer mats and water bottles for ablution. Within 2 minutes, we had transformed a major highway into an outdoor mosque. As I spread my prayer mat on the warm asphalt, feeling the rumble of stopped engines behind us, I experienced a rush of adrenaline unlike anything I had ever felt. We had done it. We had claimed this public space for our faith, forcing an entire city to witness our devotion to Allah. The moment felt powerful and righteous and terrifying all at once. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came within minutes of our prayer beginning. What started as a few car horns quickly escalated into a symphony of angry blaring that seemed to stretch for miles behind us. I tried to maintain my focus on the prayer, reciting the familiar verses, but the sound was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just frustration I was hearing in those horns, it was desperation. I opened my eyes briefly during a pause in the prayer and saw the line of stopped vehicles extending far beyond what I had imagined. Cars, trucks, buses, all packed bumper to bumper as far as my eyes could see. Steam was rising from some of the engines that had been idling too long in the summer heat. Through the windshields, I could see drivers on their phones, some gesturing frantically, others with their heads in their hands. The organizer had positioned himself at the front of our formation, and when I caught his eye, he gave me a stern look that clearly meant to keep my focus on the prayer. But something in my stomach was twisting into knots. This wasn't the peaceful demonstration of faith I had imagined. This was chaos. As we moved into the second cycle of prayer, the sirens started. First one, then several, growing louder as they approached from different directions. Police sirens I recognized immediately. But then I heard something else that made my blood run cold. Ambulance sirens, fire truck horns, emergency vehicles were trying to get through the gridlock we had created. The skeptical friend was kneeling about 10 feet to my left, and when our eyes met during a prostration, I saw my own growing panic reflected in his face. His lips were moving in prayer, but his eyes were wide with fear. He had been right to worry, and we both knew it. "Focus. Brothers," the organizer called out, his voice carrying over the noise. "Do not let their worldly concerns distract you from your worship of Allah." But worldly concerns were becoming impossible to ignore. A woman had gotten out of her car about 50 yards behind us and was running between vehicles, shouting something I couldn't quite make out. Then I heard it clearly. "My daughter is having an asthma attack. Please, I need to get to the hospital." The prayer that had felt so powerful and righteous just minutes earlier now felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Every verse I recited seemed to stick in my throat. How could I ask Allah for blessing while a child struggled to breathe just yards away from me? The enthusiastic supporter was to my right, and he seemed oblivious to the growing crisis around us. His eyes were closed in serene concentration, his prayer movements perfectly timed with the group. Part of me envied his ability to block out the chaos, but a larger part of me was beginning to wonder if that kind of spiritual tunnel vision was actually a form of blindness. Then came the sound that changed everything. The distinctive wail of an ambulance siren, much closer than the others, followed by the repeated blast of an air horn. I turned my head slightly and saw it. A white ambulance with red emergency lights flashing, completely trapped about 30 cars, back in the line of traffic. The vehicle was rocking slightly as the driver tried to edge forward, but there was simply nowhere to go. The driver's door opened and a paramedic in a blue uniform got out. Even from this distance I could see the urgency in his movements. He began running between cars trying to find a path forward, but the traffic was packed too tightly. Drivers were getting out of their vehicles too, some trying to help, others just standing around looking helpless. The skeptical friend stopped praying entirely. He was sitting back on his heels, staring at the ambulance with an expression of pure horror. When he caught my eye again, he mouthed a single word: "Stop!" But the organizer's voice boomed over the noise again. "Do not be moved by their attempts to disrupt our worship. This is exactly the kind of test the Prophet faced. Stay strong in your faith." I tried to return to the prayer, but my hands were shaking now. The Arabic verses that usually flowed so naturally from my lips felt foreign and meaningless. All I could think about was that ambulance, trapped in traffic because of what we had done. Someone inside that vehicle was fighting for their life, and we were the reason help couldn't reach them quickly. The paramedic was running back toward his ambulance now, and I could see him speaking rapidly into a radio. Other emergency responders were arriving on foot, having abandoned their own vehicles in the gridlock. They were carrying medical equipment, trying to reach whatever crisis awaited them on foot because we had made it impossible for their vehicles to pass. A police helicopter appeared overhead, its rotor wash creating small whirlwinds of dust and debris around our prayer mats. The sound was deafening, making it impossible to hear the organizers' continued calls for focus and dedication. Some of the protesters were looking up nervously, but most continued their prayers with determined concentration. The woman with the sick daughter had reached the edge of our prayer formation. She was crying openly now, pleading with anyone who would listen. "She can't breathe," she kept saying. "Please, I just need to get through." The enthusiastic supporter opened his eyes and looked at her with what I can only describe as cold indifference. "Sister," he said, "this is a sacred time. Please respect our worship." That's when something broke inside me. Here was a mother whose child was in medical crisis, and we were telling her to respect our worship while we blocked her path to help. Have you ever felt the exact moment when everything you believed about yourself turned out to be wrong? When the thing you thought was righteousness revealed itself to be something else entirely? I looked around at my fellow protesters, still kneeling on their mats, still reciting prayers while chaos erupted around us. The organizer was gesturing for everyone to ignore the distractions and continue. But how could I call a suffering child a distraction? How could I ask Allah to bless me while I prevented help from reaching someone who needed it? The ambulance siren was constant now, a wailing reminder of our responsibility for this crisis. More emergency vehicles were arriving, creating a symphony of urgent sounds that seemed to mock our peaceful prayers. Radio chatter from police officers on foot was growing more intense as they tried to coordinate a response to the traffic nightmare we had created. The skeptical friend had stopped praying entirely and was sitting with his head in his hands. When he looked up at me, his face was streaked with tears. He had seen what I was seeing. This wasn't worship. This wasn't serving Allah. This was serving our own pride at the expense of people who needed help. As the prayer reached its final movements, I remained frozen in prostration, my forehead pressed against the prayer mat that now felt like the most uncomfortable surface in the world. The asphalt was hot and rough, but it was nothing compared to the burning sensation in my chest. Something was happening to me, something I couldn't explain or understand. It felt like a voice speaking directly to my heart, asking a question I had never considered before. If this is worship, why does it feel so wrong? We were deep into the final portion of our prayer when it happened. I had my forehead pressed against the prayer mat, reciting the familiar Arabic verses that I had spoken thousands of times before, when suddenly everything changed. It wasn't a voice I heard with my ears, but something deeper, something that seemed to speak directly to my soul. The chaos around us had reached a fever pitch. Sirens wailed from multiple directions. The helicopter circled overhead with its thunderous rotors, and hundreds of car horns created a cacophony that should have made prayer impossible. But in that moment of prostration, with my face toward the hot asphalt, I experienced a clarity that cut through all the noise like a blade. It started as a warmth in my chest, different from the oppressive heat of the summer day. This warmth felt clean, penetrating like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. With it came an understanding that I cannot adequately describe in words. I suddenly saw our protest from a completely different perspective, as if I was viewing it from above, seeing not just our small formation of praying men, but the entire scope of what we had created. The ambulance trapped in traffic wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It represented someone's mother, father, child, fighting for life while we knelt on prayer mats. The hundreds of stopped cars weren't just inconveniences to brush aside for our spiritual demonstration. Each one contained human beings with their own urgent needs, their own fears, their own children who needed to be picked up from school, or elderly parents waiting for medicine, or workers who would lose pay for being late. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything you thought you knew about yourself suddenly shifted? When the story you told yourself about your motivations crumbled under the weight of truth? That's what was happening to me as I knelt there, my forehead pressed against that prayer mat on the hot highway. The voice in my heart wasn't angry or condemning. It was gentle but absolutely firm, like a parent correcting a beloved child who had lost their way. It asked me a question that penetrated every defense I had built around this protest. Is this love? I tried to push the thought away, to return to the familiar rhythm of prayer, but the question wouldn't leave me alone. Is this love? When had blocking people from reaching help become an act of worship? When had causing suffering become a way to honor God? The warmth in my chest intensified, and with it came a flood of images, an understanding that I had never experienced before. I saw the woman with the sick daughter, her face twisted with anguish as she pleaded for passage. I saw the paramedic running between cars, his training and dedication to saving lives frustrated by our obstruction. I saw drivers in the traffic jam, some of them probably Muslims themselves, watching our display of faith and feeling not inspiration but disgust. Most shocking of all, I saw myself clearly for the first time, not as a righteous defender of faith, but as someone whose pride had blinded him to the harm he was causing. Every justification I had built in my mind over the past weeks suddenly collapsed like a house of cards. We weren't making a statement about religious freedom. We were making a statement about our own arrogance. The Arabic words of the prayer continued to flow from my lips automatically, but they felt hollow now, mechanical. How could I ask Allah for blessing while actively preventing His creation from receiving help? How could I claim to worship the God of mercy while showing no mercy to those around me? Then came the most profound moment of my entire life. In that space between one prayer verse and the next, in the briefest pause between breaths, I felt something that I can only describe as a presence. Not the familiar sense of connection I had always associated with Islamic prayer, but something entirely different. Something that radiated love so pure and unconditional that it made me tremble. This presence didn't speak in Arabic or English or any human language. It communicated in understanding that bypassed words entirely, and what it communicated was this: true worship was never about blocking others from receiving help. True worship was about becoming the help that others needed. My body began shaking uncontrollably. The other protesters around me were still deep in prayer, unaware that I was experiencing something that would change the entire direction of my life. The organizer's voice continued to call out instructions and encouragement, but his words sounded distant and distorted, like someone speaking underwater. The presence I felt wasn't demanding or forceful. It was patient, waiting for me to understand what was being offered. It was as if a door had opened in my heart that I never knew existed, and through that door I could see a completely different way of living, a completely different understanding of what it meant to serve God. I thought about all the years I had spent in Islamic prayer, all the times I had bowed toward Mecca, all the verses I had memorized and recited. They had been meaningful to me, but they had never produced this kind of transformative understanding. This wasn't about religion or ritual or proving anything to anyone. This was about love in its purest form. The realization hit me with such force that I nearly cried out loud. We were causing suffering in the name of God. We were preventing healing in the name of worship. We were choosing pride over compassion and calling it righteousness. The very thing we claimed to be defending, we were actually betraying. The warmth in my chest had spread through my entire body now, and with it came uncertainty that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. This protest had to stop, not in a few more minutes when we finished our prayers, but right now, immediately, before any more harm was done. I tried to lift my head from the prayer mat but found myself frozen, not physically but spiritually. It was as if I was being held in that position until I fully grasped what was happening. The presence I felt was asking something of me, waiting for my response to the question it had posed. Is this love? No, I admitted silently. This isn't love. This is pride disguised as piety. This is selfishness dressed up as service to God. The moment I acknowledged that truth, something shifted inside me like a lock turning. The trembling in my body intensified, but now it felt like anticipation rather than fear. I was being offered a choice, a chance to step away from everything I had believed about faith and towards something entirely new. When I finally lifted my head from the prayer mat and opened my eyes, the world looked different. The same ambulance was still trapped in traffic, the same chaos surrounded us, the same urgent needs pressed in from all directions, but now I could see clearly what needed to happen. I had to stand up, I had to end this, and somehow I knew that doing so would be the most genuine act of worship I had ever performed. The moment I stood up from that prayer mat, it felt like breaking through the surface of deep water after nearly drowning. My legs were unsteady beneath me, partly from kneeling on hot asphalt for so long, but mostly from the overwhelming conviction that was coursing through my entire being. The other protesters around me continued their prayers, oblivious to the transformation happening just feet away from them. I looked directly at the organizer, who was still positioned at the front of our formation, leading the final verses of our collective prayer. His eyes were closed in what appeared to be serene devotion, but even from a distance I could see the satisfaction on his face. He was enjoying this. He was reveling in the power we held over this entire section of the city. "We have to stop," I called out, my voice cracking with emotion. "We have to stop right now." Several protesters opened their eyes and looked at me with confusion and irritation. The enthusiastic supporter turned toward me with an expression of horror, as if I had just committed blasphemy during sacred worship. "Brother Musab," he hissed, "what are you doing? Sit down and finish the prayer." But I couldn't sit down. Every fiber of my being was screaming that we needed to end this immediately. The ambulance behind us had been joined by 2 more emergency vehicles, all trapped in the gridlock we had created. I could see medical personnel abandoning their vehicles and running on foot, carrying equipment and supplies toward whatever crisis awaited them. "There are people dying," I said louder this time, addressing the entire group. "We're preventing emergency vehicles from saving lives. This isn't worship. This is murder." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several protesters stopped praying entirely and stared at me with shock and anger. The organizer's eyes snapped open, and his face transformed from peaceful devotion to cold fury in an instant. "Sit down immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had convinced us all to follow him here. "You are disrupting sacred worship, bro. You are letting their worldly concerns corrupt your faith." But the conviction burning in my chest was stronger than any human authority. I walked over to my prayer mat and began rolling it up, my hands shaking, but determined. "This isn't faith," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is pride. We're hurting innocent people and calling it holy." The skeptical friend who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes suddenly stood up as well. His face was pale but resolute. "He's right," he said quietly, then louder. "Musab is right. We have to stop this." The organizer's composure cracked for the first time since I had known him. "You fools," he spat. "You're letting them break your will. This is exactly what they want. They want us to be ashamed of our faith, to hide it away where it can't challenge their comfortable lives." "No," I replied, walking directly toward him with my rolled prayer mat in my hands. "They want their children to reach the hospital when they're sick. They want ambulances to save lives. They want fire trucks to put out fires. We're not challenging their comfort. We're blocking their survival." I turned to address the entire group of protesters. Some were still trying to continue their prayers, but most were now sitting back on their heels, watching the confrontation unfold. "Look around you," I said, gesturing toward the chaos we had created. "Look at what we've done. How many people are suffering right now because we wanted to make a statement?" The woman with the sick daughter had reached the edge of our protest area again. She was sobbing openly now, holding her phone up to show whoever would listen. "Please," she cried out. "My baby can't breathe. I just need to get through. Please." That's when something broke open in several more protesters. The hesitant follower, a man in his 50s, who had seemed uncertain about the entire plan from the beginning, stood up and began gathering his things. Then another man, then another. The unified front that the organizer had worked so hard to create was crumbling before his eyes. "Traitors," the organizer said, his voice filled with disgust. "All of you. You came here claiming to defend Islam, and at the first sign of resistance you abandon your faith." "I'm not abandoning my faith," I replied, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "I'm finding it for the first time." I began walking toward the nearest line of stopped cars, gesturing for others to follow. "We need to move our vehicles immediately. We need to clear a path for the emergency vehicles." The skeptical friend was right behind me, along with several others who had broken away from the group. But the enthusiastic supporter and about half the protesters remained on their mats, stubbornly continuing their prayers despite the chaos around them. "You're making a mistake," the organizer called after us. "You'll regret this weakness for the rest of your lives." But as I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, all I could feel was relief. The terrible weight that had been pressing down on my chest was beginning to lift. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe properly. The process of clearing the highway was chaotic and difficult. Cars had been stopped for so long that many had overheated. Some drivers were too angry to cooperate even when we explained that we were trying to fix the situation. Others were surprisingly gracious, helping us coordinate the movement of vehicles to create emergency lanes. The first ambulance that broke free accelerated past us with its sirens wailing, followed quickly by the others. I watched them disappear toward the hospital, carrying their precious cargo of human life that we had delayed for precious minutes. Those minutes might have made the difference between someone living or dying, and that knowledge would stay with me forever. As we worked to clear the remaining traffic, I kept glancing back at the protesters who had remained. The organizer was still leading them in prayer, his voice defiant and angry now rather than peaceful. But even his most loyal followers were beginning to look uncertain. The contrast between our frantic efforts to help and their continued obstruction was becoming impossible to ignore. The enthusiastic supporter finally stood up, his face twisted with confusion and anger. He walked over to where I was directing traffic and grabbed my arm. "You've destroyed everything we worked for," he said. "Months of planning, all for nothing." I looked at him with something that might have been pity. "No," I said gently. "We're saving it. We're saving our souls from becoming something ugly." Within 30 minutes, we had cleared enough space for normal traffic flow to resume. Police officers who had been prepared for confrontation found themselves instead working alongside reform protesters to restore order. The whole scene had a surreal quality, like watching a movie played in reverse. As the last emergency vehicle passed through the cleared lanes, I felt something I had never experienced before. It wasn't the satisfaction I had expected from successful activism. It wasn't the spiritual high I had associated with Islamic worship. It was something deeper and more sustainable. It was peace that came from knowing I had done the right thing, even when it cost me everything I thought I believed about myself. The organizer and his remaining followers finally gave up their protest as police began making arrests of those who refused to cooperate. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked at me with such hatred that it made me shiver. But even his anger couldn't touch the calm that had settled over my spirit. Standing there on that highway, watching traffic slowly return to normal, I realized that everything I thought I knew about faith had been wrong. And somehow, that realization felt like the beginning of something beautiful, rather than the end of something precious. The nights following the highway incident were the longest of my life. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that day, feeling the weight of what I had participated in and the strange peace that had come from ending it. Sleep became elusive because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that ambulance trapped in traffic, heard that mother crying for her sick child, felt again that overwhelming conviction that had changed everything. My family noticed the change immediately. At dinner the next evening, my father asked why I seemed so distant and troubled. I tried to explain what had happened on the highway, how we had blocked traffic for prayers and how wrong it had felt, but the words came out jumbled and inadequate. How do you tell your devoutly Muslim family that you're beginning to question everything you were raised to believe? "You did the right thing by helping clear the road," my mother said gently, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. "But why does this trouble you so much? It was just a protest that went too far." But it wasn't just a protest to me anymore. It was a revelation about the difference between performing religion and actually living it. The more I thought about that moment when I felt compelled to stand up, the more I realized it hadn't felt like anything I had experienced in 28 years of Islamic worship. It had felt like something entirely different, something that transcended religious boundaries altogether. The call to prayer still echoed from the mosque near our house 5 times a day, just as it always had. But now, when I heard it, instead of feeling the familiar pull to participate, I felt a strange emptiness. The Arabic words that had once filled me with meaning now seemed like sounds without substance. I continued going through the motions for a few days, prostrating myself on my prayer rug, reciting the verses I had memorized as a child, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. My sister noticed first. Fatima was 19 and more observant than our parents about emotional subtleties. She cornered me in the kitchen one morning while I was mechanically eating breakfast, staring out the window instead of reading Quran verses as I usually did. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, sitting down across from me with her own bowl of cereal. "You've been acting weird since that protest thing." I looked at my little sister, this bright young woman who wore her hijab with such pride and confidence, and felt a stab of pain. How could I tell her that I was losing faith in everything our family held sacred? How could I explain that I felt like a stranger in my own religion? "I've been thinking about faith," I said carefully, "about what it really means to serve God." She tilted her head, studying my face. And I'm not sure we've been doing it right." The conversation that followed was the first of many difficult discussions with my family over the coming weeks. Fatima was hurt and confused by my growing distance from Islamic practices. My parents became increasingly concerned as they noticed I was missing prayers, avoiding mosque services, and asking questions that seemed to challenge fundamental beliefs. The crisis came to a head about 2 weeks after the highway incident. I had been doing research online, reading about different religious traditions, trying to understand what I had experienced that day on the asphalt. That's when I stumbled across a website about Christianity, specifically about Jesus' teachings on love and service. I had known the basic facts about Jesus from Islamic teaching, of course. Muslims revere him as a prophet, though not as divine. But reading his actual words in the Christian Gospels was a completely different experience. When I read about Jesus washing his disciples' feet, about him saying that whoever wanted to be great should become a servant of all, something clicked into place. This was what I had felt on that highway. This was the voice that had asked me if blocking others from receiving help was really love. This was the presence that had filled me with such overwhelming conviction about putting others' needs before my own spiritual performance. I ordered a Bible online and had it shipped to my workplace, afraid to have it delivered to my family home. When it arrived, I hid it in my car and read it during lunch breaks, in parking lots, anywhere I could find privacy. The more I read, the more I understood what had happened to me. Jesus' message wasn't about blocking highways to prove devotion. It was about becoming the bridge that helps others reach safety. It wasn't about forcing the world to witness your prayers. It was about praying for the world's healing and then becoming part of that healing yourself. The Gospel of Matthew hit me particularly hard. When I read Jesus saying, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," I felt that same presence I had experienced on the highway. It was as if those words had been written specifically for me, for this moment when I was exhausted by the performance of religion and desperate for something real. But understanding what was happening to me spiritually and knowing what to do about it were two completely different things. I was a Muslim man from a devout Muslim family living in a Muslim community. The idea of converting to Christianity wasn't just a personal decision. It would affect every relationship I had, every social connection, potentially my entire future. I started driving past churches on my way home from work, wondering what it would be like to walk through those doors. I imagined myself sitting in a pew, singing Christian hymns, praying to Jesus instead of Allah. The thought both terrified and attracted me in equal measure. The breakthrough came through my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She was an elderly white woman who had lived next door to my family for over a decade. We had always been polite to each other, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and neighborhood happenings, but never anything deeper than that. One evening, as I was sitting in my car reading the Bible in our driveway, she knocked on my window. My heart nearly stopped. I quickly closed the book and rolled down the window, expecting some kind of confrontation. Instead, she smiled warmly and said, "I've been praying for you." "Praying for me?" I asked. Confused and a little suspicious, "Yes," she said simply. "Ever since that day you came home looking so troubled. I could see in your eyes that you were searching for something. I've been asking Jesus to help you find what you're looking for." I stared at her in amazement. This woman, whom I had barely spoken to in 10 years, had somehow seen my spiritual crisis and had been interceding for me without my knowledge. It felt like another divine intervention, another sign that I was being guided towards something specific. "Would you like to talk?" she asked gently. "I have some experience with people who are questioning their faith." That conversation in Mrs. Patterson's living room changed everything. She didn't try to convince me of anything or pressure me to convert. She simply listened as I told her about the highway incident, about my growing questions, about my fear of what my family would think. "Faith isn't about performance," she said when I finished. "It's about relationship. And it sounds like Jesus is calling you into relationship with him." When she offered to pray with me, I found myself saying yes before I fully realized what I was agreeing to. But as she placed her gentle hand on my shoulder and spoke to Jesus as if he was right there in the room with us, I felt that same presence again, that same overwhelming love and acceptance. By the time I walked back to my own house that evening, I knew what I had to do. The decision was both the hardest and the easiest I had ever made. I was going to follow Jesus regardless of the cost. The decision to follow Jesus was just the beginning of the most challenging and rewarding journey of my life. That first prayer in Mrs. Patterson's living room, when I asked Jesus to forgive me and become my Lord and Savior, felt like stepping through a doorway into an entirely different world. The peace I had experienced on the highway that day was nothing compared to the deep, lasting transformation that began in my heart that evening. But peace doesn't mean the absence of storms, and the storms in my life were just beginning. When I finally worked up the courage to tell my family about my conversion 3 weeks later, the reaction was everything I had feared and worse. My father, a man who had never raised his voice to me in my entire life, erupted in a rage I had never seen before. "You have betrayed everything," he shouted, his face red with anger, and what I now realized was also deep pain. "Your family, your heritage, your faith, everything we raised you to be." My mother wept quietly in the corner of our living room, occasionally looking at me as if I had died rather than simply changed religions. The disappointment in her eyes was almost harder to bear than my father's anger. This was the woman who had taught me my first prayers, who had proudly watched me grow in Islamic faith, who had dreamed of seeing me become a respected member of our mosque community. "How could you do this to us?" she whispered through her tears. "How could you abandon the faith of your ancestors for the religion of those who have oppressed Muslims for centuries?" I tried to explain that this wasn't about politics or cultural conflict, that it was about a personal encounter with divine love that had transformed my understanding of what faith could be. But my words fell on ears that were too hurt and shocked to really hear what I was saying. To them, my conversion felt like a complete rejection of everything they had given me, everything they valued most in life. My sister Fatima's reaction was perhaps the most painful of all. She refused to speak to me for 2 months, treating me like I was invisible when we passed in the hallway of our family home. When she finally did speak to me, it was only to ask if I was planning to try to convert her and our parents to Christianity too. "That's what Christians do, isn't it?" she said with a bitterness that broke my heart. "They pretend to love people just to steal them away from their real families." The broader Muslim community's response was swift and devastating. Word spread quickly through our mosque and the networks of families we had known for years. Some people were merely disappointed. Others were openly hostile. The organizer, who had been released from jail with a suspended sentence, started a whisper campaign about my supposed betrayal of the protest movement and my abandonment of Islamic principles. I lost friendships that had lasted decades, business relationships that had been built on trust and shared faith evaporated overnight. Invitations to community events stopped coming. At the grocery store and other public places, people I had known since childhood would turn away when they saw me, as if my presence was somehow contaminating. The loneliness was crushing. There were nights when I lay in bed questioning whether I had made a terrible mistake, whether the price of following Jesus was too high to pay. But every time I was tempted to renounce my new faith and return to the familiar comfort of my old life, I would remember that moment on the highway when I felt God's love so clearly, and I would know I could never go back to performing religion instead of living it. Mrs. Patterson became my lifeline during those dark months. She introduced me to Pastor Williams at her church, a kind man in his 60s, who had experience helping people from different religious backgrounds navigate the challenges of conversion. The first time I walked into that church, my hands were shaking with nervousness and anticipation. The building itself was nothing like the mosque I was used to. Where Islamic architecture emphasized geometric patterns and calligraphy, this Christian sanctuary was filled with stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes and a large wooden cross at the front. But what struck me most wasn't the visual differences, it was the atmosphere of welcome I felt from the moment I walked through the doors. Nobody stared at me or whispered about the Muslim man attending their service. Instead, several people introduced themselves warmly, sharing their own stories of faith, journeys, and spiritual transformation. I learned that many Christians had their own experiences of questioning, doubt, and eventual surrender to Jesus that resonated deeply with my own story. The worship service itself was a revelation. Where Islamic prayer had become mechanical recitation for me, Christian worship felt alive and personal. When the congregation sang hymns about Jesus' love and sacrifice, I found myself crying for reasons I couldn't fully explain. These weren't tears of sadness, but of recognition, of finally finding the words and melodies that expressed what my heart had been trying to say. Pastor Williams met with me weekly for months, patiently answering my questions about Christian theology, helping me understand how to read the Bible, and guiding me through the practical aspects of living as a follower of Jesus. He never pressured me to make decisions quickly or criticize my Islamic background. Instead, he helped me see how my previous spiritual experiences could actually enrich my understanding of God's grace. God was working in your life long before you recognized Jesus, he told me during one of our conversations. That conviction you felt on the highway, that desire to serve others rather than yourself, that was the Holy Spirit preparing your heart for this moment. The decision to be baptized came naturally after 6 months of studying Christian doctrine and growing in my relationship with Jesus. The baptism itself, performed in a small lake outside the city on a crisp autumn morning, felt like the final step in a journey that had begun on a hot highway the previous summer. As Pastor Williams lowered me into the water and raised me up again, I felt like I was literally being reborn. The old Musab, who had measured spirituality by external performance and religious activism, died in those waters. The new Musab, who understood that faith meant becoming love in action, emerged ready to serve God in ways I had never imagined possible. The transformation in my daily life was immediate and profound. Instead of 5 ritual prayers facing Mecca, I found myself in constant conversation with Jesus throughout the day, talking to him about everything from major decisions to minor frustrations. Instead of fasting during Ramadan as a religious obligation, I began fasting periodically as a way to focus more clearly on spiritual growth and prayer for others. Most importantly, my understanding of service changed completely. Where I had once seen religious activism as making bold public statements about faith, I now understood that true service meant quietly meeting people's practical needs without expecting recognition or reward. This led me to volunteer work that would eventually become my calling. I started spending time at the local hospital, initially just visiting patients who had no family nearby. But as I learned more about the challenges facing emergency medical services, I felt drawn to explore how I could help rather than hinder their life-saving work. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had once blocked ambulances was now training to support them. When I enrolled in a program to become a hospital chaplain, specializing in emergency and trauma care, it felt like God was redeeming even my worst mistakes and turning them into opportunities for healing. My family relationships, while still strained, began to slowly heal as well. When my father suffered a heart attack 2 years after my conversion, I was the one who rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital, holding his hand and praying for his recovery. In that moment he saw not the son who had abandoned his faith break up, but the son who loved him enough to be present in his greatest moment of need. "You're still my boy," he whispered as we reached the emergency room. Different faith, same heart. Today, 5 years after that highway protest that changed everything, I work as a chaplain in the same hospital system that serves our city's emergency medical needs. Every day, I see ambulances arriving with patients whose lives depend on getting help quickly and efficiently. Every day, I'm reminded of how close I came to being part of the problem instead of part of the solution. I've had the privilege of sharing my testimony at churches, interfaith dialogue events, and community gatherings across the region. But more importantly, I've been able to build bridges between the Muslim and Christian communities in our city, helping both sides see that faith at its best is about love in action rather than religious performance or political statements. The highway that was once blocked by my misguided activism now flows freely, carrying emergency vehicles to people who need help, families to important gatherings, and ordinary people to ordinary destinations that matter deeply to them. And I've learned that this is what real worship looks like, keeping the pathways clear for healing, hope, and love to reach everyone who needs them. Look inside your own heart right now. What highways are you blocking in your spiritual journey? What emergency vehicles of grace are you preventing from reaching people who desperately need help? The same Jesus who reached me on that hot asphalt in the middle of my pride and confusion is reaching for you right now, offering to transform your performance into purpose, your activism into authentic love. The choice is yours, just as it was mine, but I can promise you this: the road that leads through surrender to Jesus is the only highway that truly leads to life.